be a clear ROI for many organizations. A lot of times, unfortunately, the knowledge capabilities are considered to be more of a cost center and rather than a revenue center, so it's hard to justify. But we're trying to combine those things right now with things like intelligent virtual assistants that can provide revenue and also solve internal knowledge problems. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about today, is how to connect the dots between some of the skills that we have traditionally seen in the library science and information management space with some of the emerging technologies, and how it's more important today to have a seat at the table than ever. And you know, a lot of organizations are not necessarily recognizing that. So hopefully we can give you some ideas on how to make that case and present your skills and even reinvent or reposition what you're doing as necessary.
That's great, Seth. And, you know, that's something that we've been talking a lot about, is the different skills that librarians have and the way that they're using them, you know, in different areas of the organization. And, I love your term, the data wrangler. And I know that, you know, I listened to the talk that you and Tom Davenport did a little while ago, and you know, saying that you both sort of came out of knowledge management, but yours was sort of, you're sort of on a little bit of different pathways, but you're both interested in that information architecture within organizations. And so your new book, which is, I think, behind you on your shelf there, is entitled, here we are, AI-Powered Enterprise. And the subtitle is Harness the Power of Ontologies to Make Your Business Smarter, Faster, and More Profitable. So we want to hear what you have to say to us about the core of your thought.
Absolutely, absolutely, and happy to do so. And what's interesting behind me, this is a little sculpture that kind of inspired both our logo and the book cover. And it's actually, I think of this as the way we look at data. You know, there's structured ways of looking at it, and we have to have that architecture. But then as you look at the data from different perspectives, you kind of get infinite perspectives on its usage, right? The different ways that the organization can leverage data is varied, is infinite. But the structure has to be there. And that's what the ontology represents. The ontology represents that core structure. And then we have all of these different ways of interpreting and leveraging that data. So I just thought I'd put that little physical metaphor in front of you, or representative. But the idea, and by the way, we've had some very good feedback from experts in the marketplace. So, you know, it can't be all wrong. The idea is to say, you know, how do we leverage ontology? How do we think of ontology? How is it different than stuff that we're already doing or things that are already happening in organizations? You know, how we need to think about data sources and training, especially around machine learning and artificial intelligence. People talk about training data. We don't have enough training data. So how do we think about that? And how do we leverage a consistent set of organizing principles so that we can manage it and leverage it appropriately? You know, there's a lot of one-offs and a lot of unscalable initiatives. And so what we're finding is that, you know, if you use an ontology that provides that consistent view of data for your any information management program, you can leverage it to solve problems today while you're also preparing the organization for future capabilities. So it really has to be thought of as foundational to lots of things, and it is a little different than starting with master data, and I'll explain why that is. But let's talk about ontology. And many folks understand that at a high level, it's really a way of thinking about a domain of knowledge, of describing a domain of knowledge. It says, well, the branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being, well, that's pretty broad. We don't necessarily need that definition, but it's really how we describe a domain of knowledge or information. So for life sciences, it's diseases and mechanisms of action and and biological targets and generic drugs and brand names and indications and treatments and symptoms and so on. For an insurance company, it's risks and regions and products and services. For a manufacturer, it's their products and processes and so on. So really, folks are used to understanding, taxonomies. And when we think about all the different ways that we describe our information throughout the organization, we always have multiple taxonomies. It's never one grand galactic uber taxonomy. There are multiple hierarchies. There's multiple controlled vocabularies. And the ontology is the relationship between them. It's all of those. It becomes that knowledge scaffolding for the organization. Now, I loved this article a couple of years ago, which talked about the need for ontologies and knowledge bases and domain models for AI. And, a lot of organizations are still not recognizing this. But the fact is, when you're building these applications, they don't know, vendors will say things like, oh, our system does it all. Well, AI and those types of systems do not know what's important to your organization. They do not know your products. They do not know your services. They do not know your value proposition, your solutions. Those relationships, those knowledge relationships really become the core of the business. And it's not easy to represent that in master data. It really starts at the business level, at the conceptual level, and then gets translated in lots of different formats and structures. And we'll talk more about that. But the whole idea here is that, the industry seemed to miss a lot of this. And I think still misses a lot of this when they start pushing out these virtual assistants or really any of these machine learning applications. It was interesting when I first, and Tom Davenport, for those of you who don't know him, has been, he's written 20 books. He's an important muckety-muck, I guess you'd call it, in Center for Information Systems Research and the MIT Center for the Future of the Digital Enterprise. I'm getting all those titles wrong, but he has a lot of credentials. He's written a couple of books, and he said, I don't always agree with you on the fact that you need ontologies for certain machine learning applications. And I said, Tom, if you disagree, put it in your forward. I don't torpedo my book, but present a balanced argument. And he did a really great job of doing that. What he said, basically the idea is you could take a machine learning application and say, it doesn't need any reference data. It just works on the data and identifies patterns. Let's imagine you have machine vision. You have the machine vision and it recognizes defective parts coming off the manufacturing line. Great. Well, what product? What manufacturing line? What process? What are the procedures that need to be remediated? Who's responsible? How does it get acted upon? It's contextualizing the insights that requires the knowledge architecture. One organization we're working with has tens of thousands of variables, hundreds of thousands of variables, and they have orphan data because they can't put it into a knowledge architecture. They can't get the insights and apply the insights. So what I'm saying here is that this is essential, and this is foundational, and this is what's necessary. And the reason why many AI projects are failing is because they don't think of this holistically, and they're limited in terms of the data quality, and they're not doing a lot of the blocking and tackling that is required. So again, the soundbite definitions for taxonomy, you know what a taxonomy is: parent-child, whole part relationships. We know what a thesaurus is. A thesaurus basically shows associative relationships, things that are conceptually related, and non-preferred terms. And an ontology is really a collection of all the thesaurus structures and all the taxonomies and the relationships between them. It's never done. and what's interesting is, people think, okay, let's get an off-the-shelf taxonomy, right? Or let's buy an ontology. Well, it's really about fitness to purpose. And it's really about the use cases and scenarios and processes that are unique to the organization. I once worked with a defense organization, and we spent 3 days working with their teams, building out the architecture, building out the taxonomies. They did a fantastic job, had something really well-defined and precise and fit their use cases. And then I ran into the head of the program a couple of weeks later, and he said, oh, I found this great defense ontology and all these taxonomies, and I just dumped them I imported them into the system. I'm like, no, no, you're not getting it. That's not what you do. It's not about more terms. It's about the right terms. You can have a very complete taxonomy that is completely irrelevant. I saw one for oil and gas, and it had fuel types, and in fuel types it included peat and lamp oil. Well, tell me how much peat and lamp oil does ExxonMobil sell? And the fact is, those were legitimate terms, but they were completely irrelevant. And that is one of the most dangerous things about trying to build or leverage standard taxonomies and ontologies. We really need to have the fitness to purpose. Even if you're if you're in the same industry selling the same things, the look and feel will be different. The terminology will be different. The character will be different. Think of going into two different grocery stores, Whole Foods versus Stop and Shop. They sell the same stuff, but their aisles are organized differently. That's the same thing as a navigational hierarchy. That's the wayfinding, right? And understanding the language of your customers and what resonates with them is what's really super important about building out your organizing structures. Two companies selling the exact same thing in the exact same market will have different processes and different ways of thinking about their world. So we look at controlled vocabularies, thesaurus, taxonomy, ontology. These are increasing levels of complexity. I might disagree. This is, I did this with a colleague who kind of debated that taxonomy was more complex or sophisticated than thesaurus. I kind of disagreed because, anyway, I want to get into it. But knowledge graph is really an implementation of the ontology because it also includes data elements. Now, some of you may have seen this slide before. I used it many years ago. But the idea is to say, taxonomy is not the same as navigation, and you have different purposes for different vocabularies. A customer might care about finding a board game, whereas a brand manager might care about, the specific brands that they have. But then when you start extending this, again, we have more complexity of the relationships in our thesaurus structures. This is kind of an example of, the hierarchical, the equivalent, and I don't want to go through this basic stuff because you guys all know this. I'm not going to go, but then you start building out the ontology and the knowledge graph, and it starts adding instances of your data. And what this does is it allows the ability to integrate data sources more effectively, more quickly, and it allows you to navigate through this knowledge scaffolding, this knowledge structure. Graph data is what gives you the Facebook friend of a friend. What are all the things you have in common with this person or could have in common with this person? Did you go to the same school, or did you have a common employer or association or whatever it is? That is the ontology. And again, we have lots of different ways of describing the different types of relationships. Again, I don't want to get into this. This is, Library Science 101. But the whole idea is you're modeling multiple aspects of the business and the information. And why is this different than master data? Master data dives right into the structures, right? You go right to the level of data. But we know that taxonomy is not just data, right? It can be a navigational construct, right? But if we go right to the data, we're missing the navigational construct. But it can also have lots of other instantiations. Imagine that you have a concept called methodology, and you're in SharePoint. People are familiar with SharePoint. You could have a site collection called methodology, right? That's one structure, and you can have navigational elements within that. You could have a site called methodology, or a professional services firm, or whatever you are. It doesn't matter. Everybody has methodologies. You could have a site called methodology. You could have a library within a site called methodology. You could have a list within a library called methodology. You could have a content type called methodology. You could have a metadata field called methodology, or you could have a term in a list called methodology. Those are all the different technical elements that get designed based on the business concept. So if you go right to the data, you're missing all of those other levels of process and nuance, okay? So when we start building the ontology, it allows us to have greater flexibility, and it allows us to have a more comprehensive view of the different aspects of the organization and the different relationships of data. And that is what is critical. Think of a reference library. You know where to find stuff because you know people think in ambiguous terms. and they don't necessarily know what they want, but they, you know, a search term is an approximation of an information need. They're short, they're ambiguous, and they're approximation. And when you hear that, you know to give them this artifact or this reference. Well, that's what we're building into our ontology. We're building those relationships so that you can direct people based on understanding their needs, and based on understanding the corpus, you can direct them to what they need. And we can do this in a very, in a much more of an automated fashion. Now, there's always going to be a need for librarians. I don't care what anybody says. There was an article a couple of years ago that said that librarian was like the career that was going away, and that's nonsense. That's a journalist, you know, talking about hype because they don't understand the principles. They don't understand the need for human judgment. And so the ontology becomes that knowledge scaffolding. It's the organizing principles. It's the Rosetta Stone that allows things to communicate, and they become more valuable, just like taxonomies over time. So I don't know if you want to, I think I'll keep blasting through this because I'm sure there's lots of questions, but Jane, tell me how you want to proceed here, because I can keep motoring on, or we can take a break and have some dialogue.
Yeah, good idea. Let's take a little break. Oh, Rebecca, did you want to say something?
Sorry, Seth, I just have a question, and I think it's good to have this kind of question, you know, as it comes up. Can you remind us what master data means?
Oh, sure. So in many organizations, people are looking for a single source of truth, right? They're saying we have different systems, and the different systems will have definitions of, say, the customer or account or history in varying formats. And when you think about the information ecosystem, some organizations have hundreds of applications. One company we worked with had 600 applications to support the customer experience, which is crazy. That's just a mess. But what happens is these different systems will be ingesting data from various locations and be manipulating that data, and then things change. So if you change your customer information in one system, well, that has to be synchronized with other systems that the customer might interact with. Master data is an effort to say, okay, here's where we're going to store the golden record of the customer. Here's where we're going to store the golden record of product information. Here's where we're going to store the reference for all of the job titles, whatever it is. It's basically looking at that source of truth for the different business entities and elements that people need to leverage. So that way they'll trust the data. That's a big problem these days, because you don't know where the data comes from, and you don't necessarily know who managed the source system, and you know how that might have been updated. People don't trust data, and so they find errors, they find inconsistencies, and master data is an attempt to fix that. But many times those projects fail because they're too big and too broad and too, you know, broad. The scope is too large.
Thanks, Seth.
Great. Oh, carry on.
Okay, sure. So now, you know, you start looking at these different types of applications. You know, we talk about cognitive applications, and that's a little bit of a misnomer because these applications don't think, right? Watson, Siri, Alexa, you know, all of these systems that we are speaking with that are interacting, they're cognitive in that they try to reduce the cognitive load on the human. And what I like to say is, and so there's two broad buckets of AI. There's the data and analytics and predictive analytics types of applications where you're looking at data, you're looking at structured data, and you're looking for patterns, fraud patterns, for example, or, you know, churn, or customers that you're going to lose, or, you know, something that it has a lot of data that you just need to train across that data and then predict an outcome. And then there are the cognitive applications, which are really about how humans are interacting with the system. So semantic search, or an intelligent virtual system, or a chatbot. Now, the problem with how these have been done is chatbot is a channel. and you still need the information, right? When Alexa, I don't know what Alexa's up to, 160,000 skills. What is a skill? A skill is a set of intents, right? An utterance, which resolves to an intent. So I can ask several different ways of changing my password or telling you that my password isn't working or I'm locked out. That those variations in utterance get translated into an intent. And the intent is a trigger, right, to retrieve information. And so the information still needs to be structured in a way that the bot can retrieve it. Now, a lot of organizations are doing these things. So we did a project for Allstate. Many of you may be aware of it at Allstate Business Insurance. It won a CAM Reality Award many years ago. I feature it in the book. And it used the knowledge engineering approach. It was about $1 million engagement, right? Now, that project worked and it provided huge ROI. But then when we started to get this flood of chatbots and cheap agents and, you know, just hand-coded, hard-coded agents that cost $10,000 that people were cranking out, they were crap, right? They just didn't work very well. And so when you say to an organization, well, to do it right, it's $1 million, they go, well, let me try it for 10,000 first. But when I first saw an organization at a conference that was delivering a chatbot, I said, well, tell me, how do you update it? How do you train it? How do you give it new use cases? And the guy opened up an administrative console, and he said, and he showed me question answer pairs, and even had like phrase variations and spelling errors in the question variations for the same answer. I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. You're not even using machine learning. You're not even using any AI. Like you're not even, this is so far off the path. And I said, well, this seems kind of cumbersome and difficult. As well, the customer has a knowledge base. I said, really? The customer has a knowledge base. Now that's a big assumption. And there's an old joke about making assumptions. It has to do with economists, and some of you may have heard this. Economist, a chemist, and a mechanical engineer on a desert island. They have a container of food. They don't have an implement to open it. And the chemical engineer is going to use seawater and sunlight etched through the top. And the mechanical engineer is going to use, you know, coconut shells and rocks and break it off. And the economist says, assume a can opener. Well, you can't assume a can opener because that's assuming the thing you don't have. So assuming a knowledge base is assuming the thing you don't have. You cannot answer it with the thing you don't have just to say it exists. So that's what's so crazy, is that people are assuming that organizations are not very good about managing the knowledge in the first place. So why is it that adding a chatbot going to change that? And so some organizations are building AI content groups. It's like, no, that's just content. So, you know, at the end of the day, you know, we have these ways of retrieving information. And I like to look at this as an intelligent assistant is just another information retrieval mechanism. And these things vary in terms of their complexity. You have different types of knowledge bases. Well, guess what? For a basic search engine, any text source is your knowledge base. It may not be very good, but you use it. If you start building more sophistication, a knowledge portal, virtual agent, and this isn't hard and fast, this is just relative relationships, you start to add complexity and you start to add sophistication and you start to add more sophisticated information architecture and layer on technologies. But again, at the end of the day, it is an information retrieval mechanism. So if we don't think of it that way, it's not magic. It is not magic, right? And so we have to still think about how we're retrieving this information. And a lot of organizations are still not thinking this way. And this is what's so surprising. Even well-funded conversational technology startups do not have a real knowledge engineering foundation. And you know, some of them are coming to us and asking us to help them with this, and we're working on some pilots, but it's very surprising. But let me just show you a couple of examples of applications. And this was the Cleveland Museum. We actually did this they covered this in the book, but it was basically looking at traffic pattern analysis. Where do people go? What do they look at? What influences how they interact with exhibits? You know, they needed to measure this, and they basically did a really great job of cleaning up a lot of data, but they had to have the identification of all of these different elements. These are the multiple taxonomies. These are, the structured relationships. And again, this was essential. You can read about the case. I don't want to go into the case study in detail. You can read about it if you buy the book, but it was required. So that was a machine learning application that worked with sensor data, and it had to have the foundational ontology in order to contextualize those insights. This is Allstate. We talked about this before, and it's featured in the book. But it's like, I need help with a policy. Well, what kind of policy? I need to determine liability coverages for employee actions for a collection agency in Massachusetts. Well, guess what? We can recognize those entities, right? There's a topic of liability coverage. There's a product, it says employee practices liability. This is employee actions. Well, guess what? That is a thesaurus entry to say that action is represented by that product, right? We have to build that relationship. There's a nature of the business, and there's a region. And then there's other context, because we know these are guidelines and we know the agents are certified. This becomes facet retrieval. This is facet retrieval. This is a question answering system. And in order to do this, we have to build a sophisticated ontology. And we had thousands of use cases, thousands of pieces of content, and a very sophisticated ontology. This is the only way to be able to access that level of detailed, precise information in this ocean of content. And this provided an enormous return on investment if it was done correctly. There's also conversational commerce. It's possible and we have a whole process called our bot factory. It's possible to make the design elements on a chatbot reusable and portable and more scalable. What you do is you abstract the design elements, the entities and the utterances, and even the responses into an ontology. And then the relationships between, say, an entity and a response can be very dynamic. This solves a bunch of problems. There's, if you look at some of the ways of treating faceted navigation or faceted search in a chatbot, when you go into like IBM's Watson, you have to build out all these different paths. It's like the old pre-coordinated taxonomy days, and you end up with a combinatorial explosion. So it's not practical. There's also the blind alley problem. We actually have a patent in process for this, but this is what you're going to start seeing, because this takes those elements and makes them usable. Right now, the way chatbots and virtual assistants are built, it actually fragments the knowledge. It makes the problem harder. These are large-scale information problems, and they have to be attacked in this way. We can also use the ontology to standardize and normalize content and ingest it across lots of different systems, right? This is componentization, which is what we use with Allstate. And again, you need to have a standardized domain model. You need to have standardized structures and ontologies, and then you can repurpose this content. And there's a lot of automated processes behind each of these. Oops, again, this is the whole scalable, portable, reusable, but code reuse. Again, when it comes to these agents, there's a lot of coding. And what you can do is you can build different functionality just by changing your ontology. So we use this to show a financial services chatbot and an insurance chatbot with all the same coding in the background. All it did was it changed the ontology. And this allows you to push it out to lots of different systems. It allows you to change it one place. I showed this to some heads of innovation at Innovation Labs. And they're like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. It's still hard to get uptake because it's very advanced. But the point is, this is where things are going. This is what we're going to have to do to make these things practical. This is just making a change in one place and pushing it across lots of different downstream systems. And here's an example. Again, I'm not going to go through all this in great detail, but suffice it to say that you get a different experience just by pointing to a different ontology. And these are the same things. These are just illustrating that. Again, I don't have to go into the details with you right now if you want to some other time. But at the end of the day, we're trying to build this enterprise architecture that is based on ontologies that will resolve and harmonize across the internal and external systems. We can't have acts of heroics upstream in our workplace and expect a seamless digital experience externally. What ontologies do for us is they give us the ability to reduce the friction of information flows in the organization. And it allows us to get greater efficiency out of and productivity out of the emerging technologies that are coming about. So I know I blasted through some of that. I didn't want to kill you with all slides today. So I just wanted to hit the high points and use that as a catalyst for discussion. And of course, there's actually a lot of press. We probably had 30 articles and podcasts out there. And I think we have we actually should have a place where we have all that referenced. I don't necessarily see it right here. Anyway, we can get that link to you. But there's Harvard Business Review had an article on their homepage about data infrastructure. We've had a lot of stuff in HR, HRMS, et cetera. There's a lot of different stuff. Anyway, that's what I'm going to leave you with, but let's continue the discussion and answer questions for you.
Thanks, Seth. That's such fabulous content and tons of it. And I reminded on chat everyone that we'd have the slides in PDF form so that they could get more out of it, because there's tons of great stuff. And you give it in such an animated, passionate way.
Oh.
That's wonderful. We love it. We love it. But yeah, I'll let people send their questions, and I'll let Rebecca look at those. But tell us a couple of things I have for you, Seth. You mentioned a few organizations that are embracing AI. Are there some others and their usages that you could share with us?
So, I go through a lot of these in the book. There's various applications like supply chain management, certainly digital commerce. There's a lot in financial services. And again, I go through each chapter has a case study that supports the arguments and stories about the people. What I would say, and actually a large organization that I was sharing this stuff with said, who's doing this? Who's doing all of this? Because I showed a whole bunch of orchestration mechanisms to do personalization at scale. And I said, organizations are doing bits and pieces of this. Financial services has been using analytics and predictive analytics for quite some time, but they're behind on the cognitive pieces. There's some support organizations like Vodafone that spent years and years and tens of millions of dollars on building virtual assistants. And they had to build their own cognitive engineers. But they ended up getting great results, but it was something like $70 or $80 million, right? So, it's just like any evolution of technology. We could build search-based applications 10 years ago at a cost of millions of dollars per application. The same thing can be done for $100,000 today. So, this has been an evolution. And what we're always trying to do is improve the ability to interact with information and the ability to reduce our cognitive load. I think that if I were to say who is the exemplar, it's got to be some of the born digital companies and the big vendors, but even those guys, are not necessarily doing all of this. And it's a very quickly evolving industry. And my sense is that there are pockets of success, but there's a lot of failures. There's a lot of failures.
And I think you're right that a lot of people are experimenting and trying it out. You just mentioned the Vodafone's cognitive engineer, and I heard you use that term before in one of your other talks, and I just think it's a wonderful term. And, librarians sort of go back and forth about, whether that title is appropriate or not. And I keep thinking about the cognitive, librarians are all about cognitive engineering. That's exactly.
Librarians are but here's what's the thing. There were no such thing as cognitive engineers. They used linguists, they used library science experts, they used information architects, they used user experience people, they used subject matter experts, they used business analysts. Librarians are cognitive engineers. Full stop. Okay?
Yep.
So you need a seat at the table. You understand this stuff. You're one-eyed people in the kingdom of the blind. I'm telling you. You know, this library science principles did not go away with the web, right? In fact, it was like a big revelation when people discovered, oh my goodness, there's a way of organizing this stuff, you know, like it was all new, you know, and you see that with every technology inflection point. People, oh, this is all new. No, there's a lot of stuff, a couple thousand years of library science, you know, culture and experience still has validation and value, even more so than ever.
So how do you see anyone getting AI into their organization? How do you see getting buy-in and the value of, you know, moving forward? Lots are experimenting,
so,
as you say, but
yes. There's a lot of science experiments. There's a lot of wasted funding, and the way to begin this process is to have realistic expectations and to look at the business problem. You want to build out scenarios and use cases. You want to understand the customer journey, whether it's an internal employee as a customer or an external customer. But what is it they're trying to accomplish, and where are the bottlenecks, and where are the friction points where they cannot get the answers they need? I like to look for high velocity decision points, like where do you need the information quickly? Otherwise, it's going to have an impact. Or where do you have a problem that is impacting efficiency or experience or revenue? And what is critical here is to have the right structure for managing resources and making decisions. And that has to be driven by metrics. There's a really great set of courses on the Marketing AI Institute website. You should take a look at that. Really good stuff. I went to this conference and I thought, I didn't have high expectations. I thought it was going to be all marketers, you know, waving their arms. And they actually had some pretty good stuff. And I actually wrote about some of the technologies in the book. But Paul Roetzer, who is the head of this organization, set up this institute, and they have some great courses. I wrote one on metrics-driven governance, or I like to say metrics-driven, the most boring topic in corporate America. I mean, governance. But it's important to measure these things. It's important to know what the baselines are. It's important to know what that user journey is, so you can be very precise about what you want to achieve. Because organizations didn't know it was possible, they kind of threw a lot of money at these things and did these moonshot projects because that's what the vendors told them. And, you know, many of the vendors didn't know what they were selling. You know, it's very difficult when it comes to emerging technology. The data scientists have ideas and capabilities in mind. The marketers interpret that. So it's an approximation. And of course, they're going to talk about all the upside and selling points and minimize the downside. And then the salesperson is going to take that marketing message and then sell it to the customer. And the poor customer is going by all these, you know, inflated expectations and unrealistic expectations. So we have to get down to the basics. We have to understand the business problems that we're trying to solve. It sounds boring. I know I'm an AI party pooper, but people are like, well, wait a minute, there's a magic approach over here. I want to try that first. Okay, good luck. Call me later. You know, it's basics. It's blocking and tackling. It's understanding the scenarios. It's understanding the customer journey. It's understanding your processes. And if you don't understand it, you can't automate it. And if it's a mess, you can't automate it. So that's what it starts with. Business problems,
Absolutely.
business objectives, scenarios, and use cases, and measurements.
Rebecca, are there some questions? I haven't had a chance to look at the chat while I've been looking at other questions.
There's so I have a couple of questions. One is, so Sharon asked about your chapter headings. So I've just given her a link there, because one of the things I like about your book is that it's very, of course, it's very organized, but it is very logical. I know that all makes sense. But also, Mary D asked, how has your business changed in the pandemic? And also, are you seeing that with people working remotely increasingly, and they're, you know, most of them we know are not going to go back into an office setting permanently or a work setting permanently.
Yeah.
Do you see that as an impetus to creating more AI-powered enterprises?
Wow, really good questions. And I have to say that, how's my business changed? Well, you know, I next time I launch a book, I'm going to plan better. I should not have launched it during a global pandemic. I'm going to think that through next time and try to plan around it. That's just poor planning on my part to launch during a global pandemic. But in seriousness, yes, it has. You know, organizations have been very, very distracted with the emergencies that they have had to deal with, and the adaptation very, very quickly to remote work. What that means is they've incurred some technical debt. They've pushed things out very quickly. I think the implications of that are not being felt yet, but you know, when you don't go into an office, you can't just walk down the corridor and bump into your colleague and ask them a question. And much of the tribal knowledge is going to have to be codified, right? It's going to have to be captured and organized more effectively. And so, yes, I believe that that's going to happen. It's going to take some time for organizations to get through the trauma of what has happened and start to really make those investments and prioritize those investments. Now, some organizations, you know, don't have time during, you know, business as usual to do the things that they need to do in terms of recovering from that technical debt from prior applications and prior implementations. And they're in the middle of these digital transformations where they're missing some of the pieces as well. So, you know, what's interesting is there's going to be, one of the organizations we're working with said this calls out an even greater need for us to do this kind of work. But it got deprioritized because people were just in crisis mode. So that's, you know, kind of how things have been playing out. I absolutely believe that it's going to cause a greater realization for the need to streamline these systems and to build these technologies and to harmonize the tools and the data sources and to really manage them more proactively. So some organizations that have had their act together said, well, wait a minute, we can't do this during busy times because everybody's too busy. Well, let's make the investment now. Others have said, you know, stop the presses, you know, everything gets canceled. So it's varied quite a bit across the board. You know, we've had some customers cancel all projects. We've had some customers keep most of the projects, but reduce scope. And we're still seeing lots of people who know they have to move forward and do this in order to survive and compete in the future.
It's really interesting to me that it's the playing field is just so different. Those people who had embraced sort of remote work in their organizations are sort of, you know, ahead of the curve than those who have said, no. And yet, you know, I was chatting with somebody the other day from a US government organization who said, you know, it's unbelievable. We're finding out how much more productive we can be, you know? So it's you're right. It's unlevel. And there are lots of experiments, and there should be lots of learning and lots of, you know, what you were talking about in terms of your roots are with knowledge management, and that's always been about collaboration, sharing the knowledge, the tribal knowledge, as you said. And so those collaborative tools hopefully are going to improve it a lot, so that we can communicate, you know, whether it's Yammer or Slack or, you know, whatever the tools are going to be. I think that's going to be pretty critical for us. And hopefully the AI piece can help that. What do you think?
Yeah, there's no question about that. You know, but there's also this need to scale a more individualized and personalized approach to our customer relationships. So, for example, there's a lot of people that have to call the call center to get routine information, pricing, availability, frequently asked questions, troubleshooting. Well, why do people call the call center in the first place? Because something was broken somewhere, right? And AI can help with that, and it can also do call deflection by answering those routine questions. But that requires a lot of pieces to be in place, right? To have the right structures and the right product information, and to capture that expertise in a format that can be automated and presented back to the customer through virtual assistants. So I think there's this whole world of evolution that has to happen in this space. You know, I opened the book with a scenario not far in the future where, you know, an individual, an executive interacts with 4 or 5 different virtual assistants and bots, and has those bots talk to other bots. That's possible. And that's what our future is going to be. It will be there. So getting from here to there is really what the book is about. But that scenario, that's how our future will be. We know that. And it's only time before we get there. But it's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And that tacit knowledge has to be captured and structured and organized in a way that these systems can help use them to help humans do their jobs and solve their problems and achieve their objectives.
Yeah, and there's so much data out there now that those, you know, AI systems can sort through so much faster than we can. And I think, you know, as you say, with the ontologies and the information structure architecture around those, you know, there's definitely, how could we not use those going forward? I like that scenario about the, you know, the various bots, they're talking to each other, and I think it's really great.
Well, the other thing to think about is this is an evolution of things we've been doing for many years, right? AI and machine learning have been around for 30 years or more. And that's why some of the folks who actually gave blurbs to the book and testimonials said, you know, this is the roadmap. Peter Johnson has been in AI for 37 years. And he said, this is the roadmap. This book is the roadmap. And I was very happy to get that feedback from him. And what's interesting is, you know, we will be getting to that point. We will be evolving. And we do need to make sure that we can spend enough time building the foundational pieces and getting that basic architecture, because again, it's not magic. It's information architecture, it's information structures, it's information science. And, you know, in order for organizations to be able to compete effectively in the future, they have to embrace this. But, you know, search has used machine learning for decades, right? You know, word processing was one of the first applications for artificial intelligence, believe it or not, right? Because they took human judgment and expertise and applied it in a program. Well, that's what we're trying to do. So we don't call it some of these things AI, but it's in there and it's under the covers. And that's just going to proliferate in the future. And the key is the understanding of the business, the use cases, the scenarios, and that data hygiene. A lot of the work we're doing with AI now is trying to make up for our past sins in data hygiene, in poor data hygiene.
Yeah,
so
I like
help, but
yeah, I liked the phrase that you used about you know, enabling data for knowledge sharing with ontologies, consistent naming, good data hygiene. I like that one, and text analytics. So all of those things are there. Yeah. Rebecca, any other questions before I ask Seth our last one?
Is your last question my question?
Yes. Would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah. So Seth, I just wondered, because, you know, you had to write your book a little while ago, and perhaps you had to couch some things. Is there anything that you wanted to say in the book, or that you'd like, you know, to say now that you weren't able to?
Well, I could use more than a few minutes to say that, but I think I would have liked to have gotten into more practical applications of knowledge graphs and graph data. I refer to them, but I don't explore them enough. So that's why I've been doing content around that. I've been partnering with data.world, which hosts the largest COVID-19 research and clinical database in the world. And I would like to enable more of the ability for organizations to practically deploy these solutions using graph data and knowledge graphs. And that's really the application. So I touched on it, I was tangential to it, but I had space limitations as well. Right. You know, I was over the book quota, but I could have kept writing a lot more, but I had a I had a disciplined editor
Oh.
in Josh Burrow.
Well, that's great. Will you come back then in the fall and talk about knowledge graphs? That would be fabulous.
I could do it tomorrow. I'll talk tomorrow about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yeah, we'll give you a whiteboard too.
Yeah,
Sure. And
you go ahead. I hear a book number 2 coming along too.
yeah, well, you know, I got to get over being burnt out from book number 1 and want to see a little more uptake. But again, I'm going to plan around global pandemics next time. I'm going to take.
Yes, yes. And we're also hoping to feature Seth at KM World in the fall. We're scheduled for November 16 to 19 in DC. We shall see. But we have a KM bookstore there, and we'll hopefully sell for signing. But in the meantime, we're about to put the link into Amazon, and we hope people will purchase your book. They'll have the PDF, and they'll have the podcast of this talk. So thank you so much, Seth.
Yeah.
That's a fabulous session.
That's really great.
It's
And there are lots
pleasure.
of sources on your website. When you go directly to your book on your website, there's lots of great stuff there too. So I can't thank you enough, Seth. I can tell you there's lots of chatter in the chat, and I'll make sure that that's sent to to you as well at your office.
And feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. That should be in the slide. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. Happy to chat about this.
That's
and there's
great.
the Ontology community of practice. If you're not on LinkedIn, if you're not part of that, you might want to check that out. I want to get more dialogue going on that community. There's a lot of, stuff. But anyway, thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. So students, did you hear that? So the Oncology community practice on LinkedIn. Ontology, sorry. Yes, the Oncology. You could join that one too. You could, but thanks so much, everyone. I will get this posted.
And ontogeny.
True.
Ontology, yes.
We're word people.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Seth.
Have a great day, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.